The information provided in this video, always remember that a crucial part of removing a person's confusion is understanding his or her unique source of it. So, the moral argument for God's existence goes a little something like this. Good and evil exists only if God exists, and by good and evil or morality. Okay. 2, good and evil exists. 3, therefore God exists. Now this is called a logically valid argument, and all that means that if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 must be true. So, the easiest way to look at this argument is just to look at the objections people raise to it. And the most common objection people raise to it is to say, hey, you don't have to believe in God to know right from wrong. The problem with that objection is that it's not actually an objection. You just affirm the truthfulness of the second premise of the argument. That's not, you just affirm that we all know that there's good and evil. And what the argument is doing is saying, okay, now that we know that, what else can we use our reason and logic to determine what else must exist, i.e. God? Okay, the second most common objection to this argument is that the idea that morality can be explained with evolution. The problem is that a lot of contradictory moralities, or a lot of contradictory ideas of what is good and evil, can be explained with evolution. In other words, evolution can't really explain morality. For example, you could say, as a species, if the species is greedy and selfish and kills one another and steals from one another, that species will die out. But if the species believes in being nice to one another and taking care of one another, that species will continue to reproduce. And so evolution will eventually kill off the immoral species or the nasty species, and the nice ones will continue to exist. Thus, here we are today believing in being nice. The problem is that you could have a different morality that evolution would still benefit. For example, a species could believe that birth-defected children should be eaten. And while that would seem totally immoral to us, that would be a huge evolutionary advantage as long as that species knew the difference between a birth-defected child and a non-birth-defected child. As long as they had a clear way to make that distinction, that would be a huge evolutionary advantage. So how can you explain two completely different moral systems of two completely different ideas of what is good with just evolution? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, all evolution is going to tell you is that if the species does X, then C will happen. If the species does Y, then B will happen. But which is better, C or B? Which is better, X or Y? That's the moral question. What is the way things ought to be? And that's why morality must be grounded in someone, because things just are what they are. They just do what they do. They just have the properties they have. To have an idea about the way things ought to be or should be requires somebody. Now, the third most common objection you hear is that morality can be based on reason. Like, so, for example, we use science to tell that, there's bacteria, and if you take a bath, you'll live longer. Okay? The problem with that idea that you can base morality on science in that way, or reason, is that you're not basing your morality on that. You're just making it more specific. In other words, you're coming into that question with an assumption that it's better to live longer. So if you're not explaining why you think it's better to live longer, you're not really explaining morality. You're already coming into the system with morality already assumed. And you're just using science to make your morality more specific. What more specifically should I do? The next most common objection you hear is that the biblical God is immoral. Makes all these evil commands and does these evil things in the Bible. There's two problems there. First, are you admitting that there's a God with that statement? I mean, because you're just objecting to the biblical God. So are you saying, well, there's a God, it's just not this God? You need to ask yourself that. The second problem with that is that 3,000-year-old texts are easily misunderstood and may seem immoral to us, but that doesn't mean they are immoral, because we're separated by a lot of history. I'll just give 2 examples. Slavery is mentioned in the Bible, and we immediately think, well, that's evil. But in the Bible and in those days, people sold themselves into slavery voluntarily for a lump sum of money up front for a period of years or even their whole lifetime. They basically, wanted to work for this guy for the rest of their life. And, wanted to live on his setup and eat his food and have their kids grow up with his, system. It's like, making a career. It's not the same, And it even says in the Old Testament, like, selling yourself into slavery, forcing someone into slavery is punishable by death. That's evil. Or owning a forced slave is punishable by death. Or for example, it says to stone disobedient children in the Old Testament, and we think, well, that's terrible. But in their day, there was no local government. The family and the father was the local government, and you stayed under your father's authority until he died. So there were no police, no prisons. I mean, if you offended the king, then they would have a jail for that. But local problems were dealt with on the local level. Everything from murder to theft through the family. That was the basis of local government. The next most common and there are other issues with the Old Testament, like for example the mass murder genocide question. Click here if you want to look at the video I have about that, and we'll keep going. But the next most common objection you hear is that man can make our own morality, and that makes a lot of sense because morality has to be based in someone, not some things. Things just are what they are. Morality is about the way things ought to be, and that requires somebody. Implicitly, it implies that there is someone to have intentions and purpose. And we say, well, humans have intentions and purpose, so we can make morality, we can make our own meaning in life. And the problem with that is that which man? Which person makes the morals? Which person decides what is the right kind of life to live for us all? Or do we all decide our own? I mean, obviously, how do you even decide? Do you just roll a dice? You need this to come from somebody, some ultimate somebody. It needs to be grounded in an ultimate being, not just anyone. Okay? And the next most common objection you get is that proving God is not even a biblical idea. The problem is that the book of Ecclesiastes is dedicated to the defense of the first premise of this argument. In other words, the second premise, the idea that there's good and evil, and that some things really are wrong, most people agree with that. The issue is, does that mean that God has to exist, which is what the first premise is about. And that is what the book of Ecclesiastes is dedicated to defending. It says that life has no meaning. In other words, without God, outside of God. In other words, if there's no such thing as good and evil, then no action is any better or any worse than any other action, and therefore life is purposeless and pointless. And what Ecclesiastes does is it goes through everything in life and says, will this bring meaning to life? And it concludes, no, only God can bring meaning to life. Alright? And the final objection you sometimes get is that, hey, how does God decide the morals for us? Does He roll the dice in heaven, or does He appeal to some higher authority? And the simple answer to that is just to simply say, the buck has to stop somewhere, and that whatever it is, it has to be someone, not something. We don't know everything there is to know about God, but we know morality is implicitly from purpose and thought and intent. And obviously God, wherever morality comes from, that's the authority over our lives, over the universe. So it has to be somebody, so it must be God. And we can say, well, does God roll the dice to make up the morals and just make them up arbitrarily? Well, no, that doesn't make sense. Does He appeal to some higher somebody? Well, that doesn't really solve the problem. So He has to be the moral system. He can't simply choose it. He has to be it. And that's the only way to explain morality. If that's not the case, then there's no such thing as good and evil, and I can, come over to your house and kill you, and your family would be like, well, there's nothing wrong with what he did. Anyways, hope you found this video informative and enjoyable. Thank you for your time.